The October wind cut through the Colorado Territory like a blade, carrying the scent of early snow and something else: smoke. Thomas Garrett stood on the ridge overlooking his ranch, watching the thin grey line rise from beyond the eastern hills. His weathered hands gripped the reins of his buckskin mare, her ears twitching at sounds only animals could hear. The silence stretched wide and dangerous, broken only by the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Thomas had lived on this land for 12 years, carving out a modest existence from rock and sage. He knew every trail, every water source, every hiding place in these mountains. But today, something felt different. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for violence to spill across the valley like a flash flood. He was about to turn back toward the cabin when he saw movement on the far slope. A figure stumbled through the scrub oak, moving with the desperate rhythm of someone running for their life. Thomas squinted against the morning glare, making out the shape of a young man, lean and dark-haired, wearing the earth-toned clothing of the Ute people. Blood darkened his shirt and his left arm hung useless at his side. Thomas urged his mare down the slope, hooves striking stone and sending small avalanches of gravel cascading ahead of them. The wounded man looked up at the sound, his face a mask of pain and weariness. He was young, maybe 20, with intelligent eyes that missed nothing. When he saw Thomas approaching, he straightened despite his injuries, hand moving instinctively toward the knife at his belt. "Easy there," Thomas called out, raising one hand in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to hurt you." The young man's eyes darted past Thomas, scanning the ridgeline for other riders. When he saw none, some of the tension left his shoulders, but his guard remained up. Thomas dismounted slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "You're bleeding pretty bad," Thomas observed, noting the way the man favored his left side. "That needs tending." The young man studied Thomas for a long moment, taking in his worn clothes, the honest lines of his face, the way he kept his hands visible. Finally he spoke, his English accented but clear. "You are Thomas Garrett, the rancher." Thomas nodded, surprised to be recognized. "I am. And you are?" "I am called Swift Eagle. I scout for Chief Are's band." The young man's voice was steady despite his pain. "I know of you. You trade fairly with our people. You do not cheat or steal." Thomas felt a flush of something like pride at the words. In a territory where most whites viewed the Ute as obstacles to be removed, he had always tried to deal with them as equals. It had cost him friends among the other ranchers, but it had also kept his land peaceful. "What happened to you?" Thomas asked, noting the systematic way Swift Eagle's wounds had been inflicted. These weren't random injuries from a fall or animal attack. Swift Eagle's face darkened. "Soldiers, they came to our winter camp yesterday at dawn. They said we must leave, go to the reservation in Utah. When Chief Ure asked for time to gather our people, they began shooting." His voice carried the weight of fresh grief. "Many died. Women, children, elders who could not run fast enough." Thomas felt ice form in his stomach. He had heard rumors of military movements in the area, but nothing specific. How many soldiers? 200, maybe more. They have cannons, many horses. They burn everything: lodges, food stores, sacred places. Swift Eagle's good hand clenched into a fist. "I escaped to bring word to the other bands. They must know what comes." Thomas looked at the young man's injuries with new understanding. Swift Eagle hadn't been trying to fight. He had been trying to survive long enough to warn his people. It was an act of courage that deserved respect. "How far do you need to go?" Thomas asked. Swift Eagle pointed toward the high country, where the peaks disappeared into grey clouds. 3 days ride to the north. There are 5 bands scattered through the mountains. They must be warned before the soldiers find them." Thomas studied the wounded scout. Even on a good day, that was a hard journey. In Swift Eagle's condition, it would be impossible. The young man would die of blood loss and exposure before he reached the first camp. "You'll never make it on foot," Thomas said quietly. Swift Eagle's jaw tightened. "I must try. My people depend on it." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, weighing his options. He could patch up the scout, give him some supplies, and send him on his way. It would be the safe choice, the one that wouldn't bring trouble to his door. But as he looked at Swift Eagle's determined face, he knew he couldn't live with himself if he took the easy path. "Take my horse," Thomas said suddenly. Swift Eagle's eyes widened. "What?" "Take her. She's strong, knows these mountains. She'll get you where you need to go." Thomas began untying his bedroll and supplies from the saddle. "There's jerky and hardtack in the saddlebags, enough for several days. A rifle, too, if you run into trouble." Swift Eagle stared at him in disbelief. "You would give me your horse, your supplies? We are not even friends." Thomas paused in his work, considering the question. "Maybe not yet. But I've seen what happens when good people do nothing while others suffer. I won't be that man." For the first time since their meeting, Swift Eagle smiled. It transformed his face, revealing the young man beneath the warrior's mask. "You risk much, Thomas Garrett. If the soldiers find you help me, then I'll deal with that when it comes." Thomas finished transferring his supplies to Swift Eagle's hands. "Can you ride with that arm?" Swift Eagle tested his injured limb, wincing but nodding. "I can manage." Thomas helped him mount the mare, steadying him as he settled into the saddle. The horse seemed to sense the urgency of the situation, standing perfectly still as her new rider found his balance. "Her name is Sage," Thomas said, patting the mare's neck. "She's got a good heart and strong legs. Treat her well." Swift Eagle looked down at Thomas, his expression serious. "Why do you do this? You could be killed for helping me." Thomas met his gaze steadily. "Because it's right. Because someone has to stand up when the strong prey on the weak. Because—" He paused, searching for words. "Because I've seen too much hate in this world. Maybe it's time for something different." Swift Eagle nodded slowly, understanding passing between them. "I will not forget this, Thomas Garrett. Neither will my people." "Just get yourself to safety," Thomas replied. "That's all the thanks I need." Swift Eagle gathered the reins, then looked back one more time. "If you ever need help, any help at all, you have only to ask. I give you my word." Thomas stepped back as Swift Eagle urged the mare forward. Within minutes, they had disappeared over the ridge, leaving only dust and the echo of hoofbeats on stone. Thomas stood alone on the mountainside, watching the empty horizon and wondering if he had just signed his own death warrant. The walk back to his cabin took 2 hours, time enough for Thomas to think about what he had done. By the time he reached his front door, he could hear the distant sound of many horses moving through the valley below. The cavalry was coming, just as Swift Eagle had warned. Thomas spent the rest of the day preparing for visitors. He hid his best supplies, buried his savings, and made sure his rifle was clean and loaded. When the soldiers finally arrived at his door just after sunset, he was ready for them. The officer in charge was a young lieutenant with eager eyes and a pristine uniform. Behind him rode a company of dusty, hard-faced men who looked like they had seen recent action. Thomas counted at least 40 soldiers, more than enough to handle one lone rancher. "Thomas Garrett?" the lieutenant asked, consulting a small notebook. "That's me, Lieutenant Morrison, 4th Colorado Cavalry. We're tracking a hostile Indian who attacked our column earlier today. Have you seen any sign of him?" Thomas kept his expression neutral. "Can't say I have." "What's this Indian supposed to have done?" "He's a scout for the renegade band we're relocating. Killed 2 of our men during the engagement." Morrison's voice carried the righteousness of someone who believed his own version of events. "He's wounded, on foot, probably desperate. Could be dangerous." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "I'll keep an eye out. If I see anything suspicious, I'll send word." Morrison studied him for a moment, then gestured to his men. "We'll search the area anyway. Nothing personal, you understand. Just being thorough." The soldiers spread out across Thomas's property, looking through his barn, his root cellar, anywhere a man might hide. Thomas watched them work, his heart hammering against his ribs. If they found any sign of Swift Eagle, any evidence that he had helped the young scout, after an hour of searching, the soldiers regrouped empty-handed. Morrison looked frustrated, his earlier confidence shaken. "You're sure you haven't seen anything?" "A wounded Indian on foot couldn't have gotten far. Like I said, I haven't seen hide nor hair of anyone," Thomas replied evenly. "But I'll let you know if that changes." Morrison nodded reluctantly and signaled his men to mount up. As they prepared to leave, he turned back to Thomas. "You know, Mr. Garrett, some of the other ranchers have mentioned that you're sympathetic to the Indian cause, that you trade with them, treat them as equals." Thomas felt the threat in the words but kept his voice steady. "I treat all people with respect, Lieutenant. It's how I was raised. Just remember which side you're on," Morrison said coldly. "In times like these, a man's loyalties become very important." The soldiers rode away into the gathering darkness, leaving Thomas alone with his racing thoughts. He had bought Swift Eagle some time, but at what cost? Morrison's words had been a clear warning. He was being watched, suspected of divided loyalties. One wrong move, and he would find himself facing a firing squad. The next morning brought no relief. Thomas woke to find fresh horse tracks around his cabin, evidence that someone had been watching him during the night. He went about his morning chores with practiced calm, but every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Every sound might herald the arrival of more soldiers. It was midday when he heard the first shots echoing across the valley. They came from the north, where the mountains rose in jagged peaks toward the sky. Thomas counted the volleys, organized, disciplined, the sound of trained soldiers engaging an enemy. His stomach clenched as he realized what was happening. The cavalry had found one of the Ute bands. The shooting continued for most of the afternoon, sometimes heavy, sometimes sporadic. Thomas tried to continue his work, but his mind kept drifting to Swift Eagle. Had the young scout made it to his people in time? Had his warning been enough to help them escape, or had Thomas's sacrifice been in vain? As the sun began to set, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, the shooting finally stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the gunfire, heavy with implications Thomas didn't want to consider. He stood on his porch, watching the northern peaks, and wondered how many people had died today because of mankind's endless capacity for cruelty. That night, Thomas slept fitfully, haunted by dreams of burning lodges and crying children. He woke several times, thinking he heard voices in the wind, the sound of many horses moving through the darkness. But when he looked out his windows, he saw only stars and shadows. Dawn came slowly, creeping across the valley like a reluctant witness. Thomas was outside feeding his chickens when he heard it, a sound like distant thunder, but rhythmic, purposeful. He looked up to see dust rising from the southern trail, a lot of dust, as if made by many horses moving fast. At first, he thought it was the cavalry returning. But as the riders crested the ridge, Thomas realized his mistake. These weren't soldiers in blue uniforms. These were Ute warriors, painted for war, their faces grim with purpose. At their head rode a figure Thomas recognized, Swift Eagle, alive and whole, mounted on the mare Thomas had given him. Thomas stood frozen as the war party approached, too stunned to move. There had to be 200 warriors, maybe more, all armed and ready for battle. This was the kind of force that had given the U.S. Army nightmares for decades, the reason entire regiments had been called in to pacify the territory. Swift Eagle raised his hand, and the war party came to a halt just yards from Thomas's cabin. The young scout dismounted and walked forward, his movements strong and sure. The wounds that had nearly killed him just days ago seemed to have healed completely. "Thomas Garrett," Swift Eagle said formally, "I have returned your horse, as promised." Thomas found his voice. "You came back. I thought, after yesterday's fighting." "Yesterday's fighting was just the beginning," Swift Eagle replied. "The soldiers think they won a victory, but they only killed the old and the weak who could not flee. The warriors escaped, thanks to your warning." Thomas looked at the assembled war party, understanding dawning. "You're going after the soldiers." "We are going to defend our people," Swift Eagle corrected. "But first, I wanted to return your horse and to ask you a question." Thomas waited, his heart pounding. You risked your life to help me warn my people. You asked for nothing in return. Why? Thomas considered the question, aware that his answer might determine whether he lived or died. Because it was right. Because someone has to stand against injustice, even if they stand alone. Swift Eagle nodded slowly. You said you have seen too much hate in this world, that maybe it is time for something different. I did. Then come with us. Thomas stared at him in shock. What? Come with us, Swift Eagle repeated. Show the soldiers that not all white men are their enemies. Show them that some will fight for justice, even when it means standing against their own people. The weight of the invitation settled over Thomas like a heavy blanket. Swift Eagle was offering him a chance to truly make a difference, to stand up for his beliefs in a way that mattered. But it would also mean crossing a line he could never uncross, making himself an enemy of his own people. I don't know how to fight like you do, Thomas said quietly. You have already shown more courage than most warriors, Swift Eagle replied. The rest can be learned. Thomas looked at the war party, at the faces of men who had every reason to hate him but were willing to accept him as an ally. He thought of Lieutenant Morrison's threat, of the systematic destruction of an entire people, of all the times he had stood by and done nothing while others suffered. What about my ranch? He asked. What about it? Swift Eagle countered. Will it matter if you are dead? Will it matter if your people succeed in destroying mine? Thomas knew the young scout was right. His ranch, his quiet life, his safety, none of it would matter if he continued to stand aside while evil triumphed. Sometimes a man had to choose between his comfort and his conscience. All right, Thomas said finally. I'll come with you. Swift Eagle smiled and clasped Thomas's shoulder. Then mount your horse, Thomas Garrett. Today we ride for justice. Thomas saddled Sage quickly, his hands steady despite the magnitude of what he was doing. As he swung up onto her back, he felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. For the first time in years, he was acting in accordance with his deepest beliefs. Consequences be damned. The war party moved out as the sun reached its zenith, 200 Ute warriors and one white rancher riding together toward an uncertain fate. Thomas rode beside Swift Eagle, acutely aware of the stares and whispers his presence generated. But no one challenged his right to be there, and gradually the warriors began to accept him as part of their band. As they rode, Swift Eagle told Thomas about the previous day's battle. The soldiers had attacked a winter camp, killing dozens of non-combatants before the warriors could organize a defense. The cavalry had retreated when faced with organized resistance, but they had left behind a trail of devastation that demanded justice. They think they are safe in their fort, Swift Eagle explained. They think we will scatter to the winds like leaves in autumn. They are wrong. Thomas nodded, understanding the young scout's anger. The soldiers had committed an atrocity, and under the harsh laws of the frontier, atrocities demanded retribution. The question was whether that retribution would lead to justice or simply more violence. As they approached the cavalry's position, Thomas began to see the tactical genius of Swift Eagle's plan. The soldiers had taken refuge in a narrow canyon, thinking the high walls would protect them from attack. But Swift Eagle had positioned his warriors on the surrounding ridges, turning the canyon into a trap. The battle, when it came, was swift and decisive. The warriors attacked from all sides, using the soldiers' own tactics against them. Thomas found himself in the thick of the fighting, his rifle spitting fire as he defended his new companions. It was chaos, terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. When the smoke cleared, Lieutenant Morrison and his men were prisoners, their weapons confiscated, their arrogance replaced by fear. Swift Eagle stood before them, his face carved from stone, while the other warriors waited for his word. "You attacked our people without provocation," Swift Eagle said, his voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. "You killed our women and children. You destroyed our homes and sacred places. What justice demands for such crimes?" Morrison, his uniform torn and dirty, tried to maintain his authority. "We were following orders. The government has decided that your people must be relocated for the good of all." "Whose good?" Swift Eagle asked coldly. "The good of the men who want our land? The good of the politicians who profit from our misery? Or the good of the people you murdered yesterday?" Thomas stepped forward, knowing that what happened next would determine the fate of everyone present. "There's been enough killing," he said quietly, "on both sides." Swift Eagle looked at him, one eyebrow raised. "You would spare them, after what they have done?" "I would break the cycle," Thomas replied. "Show them that your people are capable of mercy even when it isn't deserved. Show them that there is another way." For a long moment the canyon was silent, except for the wind whistling through the rocks. Then Swift Eagle nodded slowly. "You speak wisdom, Thomas Garrett, but justice must still be served." What followed was unlike anything Thomas had ever witnessed. Instead of executing their prisoners, the warriors stripped them of their equipment and supplies, then released them with a message for their superiors. The message was simple: leave the Ute people alone, or face the consequences. As the defeated soldiers stumbled away on foot, Swift Eagle turned to Thomas. "You have shown me something today. That courage comes in many forms, and sometimes the greatest courage is knowing when not to fight." Thomas felt a weight lift from his shoulders. "What happens now?" "Now we go home," Swift Eagle replied, "to our people, our families, our land, and we live in peace for as long as peace is possible." The war party dispersed gradually as they made their way back through the mountains. Small groups of warriors broke off to return to their own bands, carrying word of the victory and the strange white man who had fought beside them. By the time they reached Swift Eagle's village, only a dozen riders remained. The village was a temporary thing, a collection of lodges and lean-tos hidden in a box canyon where the army would never find them. But it was home, and Thomas could see the relief in the people's faces as their warriors returned safely. Children ran out to greet their fathers, wives embraced their husbands, elders nodded approval at the young men who had proven themselves in battle. Thomas felt oddly out of place among all the reunions, a stranger in a strange land. But Swift Eagle seemed to sense his discomfort and led him to a small lodge set apart from the others. "This is for you," the young scout said, "for as long as you wish to stay." Thomas looked at the simple structure, touched by the gesture. "I don't know anything about living like this." "You will learn," Swift Eagle assured him. "My people are good teachers." Over the following weeks, Thomas did learn. He learned to hunt in the Ute way, to read the signs of weather and season, to find water and shelter in the harshest conditions. He learned their language, their customs, their deep connection to the land that had sustained them for generations. But more than that, he learned to see the world through different eyes. The mountains were no longer just obstacles to be overcome, but sacred places full of spiritual power. The animals were not just resources to be exploited, but brothers and sisters sharing the same earth. The seasons were not just weather patterns, but teachers offering lessons in patience, endurance, and renewal. As autumn deepened into winter, Thomas found himself changing in ways he had never expected. The anger and bitterness that had driven him for so long began to fade, replaced by something deeper and more lasting. He began to understand what Swift Eagle had meant about there being another way. The test came in early December, when Army scouts appeared at the mouth of the canyon. They were looking for the raiders who had attacked Lieutenant Morrison's column, offering rewards for information and threatening reprisals against anyone who harbored enemies of the government. Thomas watched from the lodge as Swift Eagle and the other war leaders debated their response. Some favored ambush, others suggested flight to even more remote country. All of them looked to Thomas for his opinion, knowing that his unique perspective might offer insights they had missed. "Let me go to them," Thomas said finally. "Let me try to make them understand." Swift Eagle shook his head. "They will kill you as a traitor." "Maybe," Thomas admitted, "but maybe not. Maybe there's still a chance for peace." The debate continued through the night, but in the end, Thomas's arguments prevailed. He would go to the Army Scouts, not as a surrender but as an emissary, carrying an offer of peace from people who had every reason to choose war. The meeting took place at dawn, in the neutral ground at the canyon's mouth. Thomas rode out alone, his hands empty of weapons, his heart full of hope and fear in equal measure. The 3 Army Scouts waited for him, their rifles ready, their faces suspicious. "You're Thomas Garrett," the sergeant said. It wasn't a question. "I am." "You're a wanted man, Garrett. Desertion, treason, aiding the enemy, that's a hanging offense." Thomas nodded calmly. "I know. Then why are you here?" Thomas took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would determine not just his own fate, but the fate of everyone in the canyon behind him. "Because I believe there's still a chance for peace. Because I believe that good people on both sides can find a way to live together without more bloodshed." The sergeant laughed harshly. "Peace? After what your red friends did to Lieutenant Morrison's column? After what Lieutenant Morrison did to a village full of women and children," Thomas corrected. "The fighting started long before your column was attacked." The 3 scouts exchanged glances, their certainty beginning to waver. Thomas pressed his advantage. "I was there when Morrison came to my ranch. I heard him threaten me for trading fairly with the Ute. I saw the aftermath of his attack on their winter camp. If you want to know who started this war, Sergeant, look to your own officers." The sergeant's face reddened. "That's enough. You're coming with us, Garrett. The colonel will want to hear what you have to say." Thomas nodded, having expected this outcome. "I'll come willingly. But first, I want to deliver a message from Chief Urey and his war leaders." "What message?" "That his people want peace. That they're willing to negotiate a settlement that allows them to remain in their traditional homeland. That they're prepared to live in harmony with their white neighbors, if those neighbors are willing to treat them with respect and dignity." The sergeant spat in the dust. "The time for negotiation is over. The government has decided that all Indians must be relocated to the reservations. That's final." "Then you're choosing war," Thomas said sadly. "War against people who have done nothing wrong except try to defend their homes and families." "We're choosing order," the sergeant replied. "The law is the law." Thomas looked at the 3 men, seeing the certainty in their eyes, the unwillingness to consider any perspective but their own. He had tried to build a bridge between 2 worlds, but some gaps were too wide to span. "Then I guess we're done here," he said quietly. The sergeant motioned for his men to surround Thomas. "You're coming with us, Garrett. Dead or alive, your choice." Thomas raised his hands in surrender, but he was smiling. "Actually, Sergeant, I think you're the one who doesn't have a choice." The sergeant followed Thomas's gaze and cursed. The canyon walls were lined with warriors, their weapons trained on the 3 scouts. They had appeared like ghosts, silent and deadly, while the soldiers were focused on their prisoner. "You set us up," the sergeant snarled. "I gave you a chance," Thomas corrected. "A chance to choose peace over war, understanding over hatred. You chose war." Swift Eagle appeared at Thomas's side, his rifle pointed at the sergeant's chest. "Lower your weapons," he said in perfect English. "You are outnumbered and outgunned." The scouts hesitated, then slowly complied. The sergeant's face was purple with rage. "This is an act of war. The army will send a full regiment to wipe you out." "Perhaps," Swift Eagle agreed. "But first, they will have to find us, and by then we will be ready." Thomas looked at the young war leader, seeing the sadness in his eyes. "This isn't what I wanted." "I know," Swift Eagle replied. "But sometimes we must choose between what we want and what is necessary. You taught me that." The 3 scouts were disarmed and released, sent back to their superiors with the same message Morrison had carried: leave the Ute people alone or face the consequences. Thomas watched them ride away, knowing that he had just witnessed the end of his old life and the beginning of something entirely new. As winter deepened, Thomas settled into his new existence among the Ute. He learned their stories, their songs, their deep spiritual connection to the natural world. He found himself changing in ways he had never expected, becoming someone he barely recognized from his days as a lonely rancher. The army did come, eventually, as both sides had known it would. But when the soldiers arrived, they found only empty lodges and cold fire pits. The Ute had vanished into the high country, following ancient paths known only to them, carrying their culture and their dignity into an uncertain future. Thomas went with them, no longer a white man who had chosen to live among Indians, but simply a man who had chosen to live according to his conscience. He had given his horse to a wounded scout, not knowing where that act of kindness would lead. Now he found himself part of something larger than himself, a people united not by blood, but by shared values and mutual respect. Years later, when peace finally came to the territory, Thomas would sometimes think about that morning when he first saw Swift Eagle stumbling through the scrub oak, bleeding and desperate. He had made a choice then, a simple choice to help someone in need. That choice had changed everything, not just for himself, but for two peoples who had learned to see past their differences to their common humanity. The horse he had given away had carried more than a wounded scout to safety. It had carried the hope of reconciliation, the possibility of understanding, the dream of a world where courage and compassion could triumph over fear and hatred. And in the end, that was the greatest gift of all.